He thought it was the miracle he and his little girl had prayed for. But this treasure carried secrets darker than he ever imagined. Whispers of a hidden past, a powerful enemy ready to take everything, and a truth that could tear families apart or finally bring them together. Will this broken father fight to protect a legacy of hope, or lose it all to greed and secrets? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Morning light filtered through the worn curtains of Eli Mercer's rental kitchen, casting pale shadows across the scratched linoleum floor. The coffee maker sputtered and wheezed, producing a watery brew that barely qualified as coffee. Eli stood at the counter, watching the thin brown liquid drip into the pot, his weathered hands wrapped around the edge of the countertop. "Dad?" Grace's voice came from the hallway. "Have you seen my blue notebook?" Eli turned to see his daughter, her dark hair still slightly mussed from sleep, already dressed for school in her favorite sweater, the one with the tiny holes in the sleeves that she refused to part with. "Check under the couch cushions, honey. That's where it was last time." Grace nodded and disappeared into their small living room. The sound of cushions being lifted and replaced followed. Eli reached for the last clean mug in the cabinet, grimacing at the empty spaces where their groceries should have been. They were running on fumes until his next handyman job came through. "Found it!" Grace called out triumphantly, returning to the kitchen with her notebook clutched to her chest. She paused, her breathing slightly labored, and reached for her inhaler on the kitchen table. Eli's heart tightened as he watched her take a puff, holding her breath for the count of 10 like the doctor had taught her. The prescription was running low, another worry to add to his growing list. "You okay, sweetie?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Grace nodded, slipping the inhaler into her backpack. "I'm fine, Dad. Just the morning stuff." She attempted a reassuring smile, but Eli could see the slight wheeze in her chest. The mail slot creaked, and envelopes clattered onto the floor by the front door. Grace moved to collect them, but Eli waved her off. "Eat your breakfast first. We've got some cereal left." While Grace poured the remnants of their cereal into a bowl, Eli retrieved the mail. Bills, bills, and more bills. One envelope in particular caught his eye, marked "Final Notice" in angry red letters. He slipped it into his pocket before Grace could see it, but his hands trembled slightly as he did so. "Dad?" Grace's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Are you going to eat something?" "Already had my breakfast, kiddo," he lied, lifting his coffee mug with a smile. The truth was, he'd been stretching their groceries by eating less himself, making sure Grace got enough. After dropping Grace at school, Eli drove his aging pickup truck to St. Mark's Church for the weekly Veterans Support Group meeting. The truck's engine knocked ominously, another problem he couldn't afford to fix right now. The meeting was the same as always. Shared stories, shared pain, shared hope. Afterward, as the other veterans filtered out, Eli found himself staring at the community notice board in the church hallway. Various flyers competed for attention: bake sales, prayer groups, lost pets. One particular notice, written in neat handwriting on pale blue paper, caught his eye. "Experienced painter needed. Barn restoration project. Must have owned equipment. Contact Dorothea Caldwell." The pay listed at the bottom was modest, very modest, but it was work. Eli knew Dorothea from church, a widow who lived alone on her family's old farm outside town. She always had a kind word for Grace, sometimes slipping her homemade cookies after service. Eli pulled out his phone and dialed the number on the flyer. After 3 rings, Dorothea's warm voice answered. "Mrs. Caldwell? This is Eli Mercer. I saw your notice about the barn painting job." "Oh, Eli, yes, the barn desperately needs attention. Are you interested?" Eli thought about the final notice in his pocket, about Grace's dwindling supply of medication. "Yes, ma'am. I have experience with farm buildings, and I have all my own equipment. When would you like me to start? Could you come by this evening to look things over? Say around 6. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be there." After picking Grace up from school and getting her settled with homework at their elderly neighbor's apartment, Eli drove out to the Caldwell farm. The spring evening was cool, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Dorothea was waiting on her front porch, her silver hair neat as always, wearing a cardigan against the evening chill. She led him to the barn, a towering structure that had clearly seen better days. The red paint was peeling badly, showing weathered wood underneath. "It needs a good scraping before painting," Dorothea explained, her eyes sad as she looked at the building. "My Herbert always kept it so nice, but since he passed..." She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Well, it's time to get it properly fixed up." Eli walked around the barn, making mental calculations. It was a big job, and the pay wasn't great, but it was honest work. More importantly, it was work he could start immediately. "I can begin tomorrow," he said, turning back to Dorothea. It'll take some time to do it right, but I'll make sure it's done properly. Dorothea smiled, relief evident on her face. Thank you, Eli. Herbert would have appreciated someone taking such care with his barn. They shook hands on the deal as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky. Eli knew the pay wouldn't solve all his problems, but it was a start. Maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to keep them afloat until something better came along. Eli's old pickup truck rattled down the winding country road, its faded blue paint catching the morning sun. The engine made that familiar knocking sound he'd been meaning to fix for months, but mechanic bills would have to wait. In the passenger seat, Grace sat with her worn sketchbook balanced on her knees, her fingers tracing the spiral binding. You didn't have to come with me, sweetheart, Eli said, glancing at his daughter. Could have dropped you at the library instead. Grace looked up from her sketchbook and smiled. I like old barns, Dad. They have character. She pulled her inhaler from her pocket and took a quick puff, something that always made Eli's heart clench. Besides, Mrs. Caldwell might have interesting stories. You know how I love stories. The truck bounced over a pothole, and Eli winced. Just remember to stay in the shade, okay? Don't want your asthma acting up. They turned onto a gravel driveway, marked by a weathered wooden sign that read, Caldwell Farm, Est 1932. The path stretched ahead, lined with ancient oak trees whose branches formed a natural archway. As they emerged from the tunnel of trees, the farm spread out before them. Acres of open fields, a white farmhouse with green shutters, and there, standing proud despite its wear, was the barn. Eli parked near the house, the truck's engine coughing to a stop. Before they could reach the porch steps, the screen door swung open with a gentle creak. Dorothea Caldwell stood in the doorway, her silver hair neat despite the humidity, wearing a simple cotton dress and an apron that had seen countless meals. Right on time, she called out, her voice warm and strong. And who's this young lady? This is my daughter Grace, Eli said, placing a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. Hope it's okay that she tagged along. Dorothea's face lit up. More than okay. I was just about to bring out some sweet tea. Come on up here, both of you. She gestured them onto the wide porch, where 2 rocking chairs and a wooden bench surrounded a small table. The porch boards creaked companionably under their feet as they settled in. Dorothea disappeared inside and returned moments later carrying a tray with 3 glasses of tea, condensation already beating on the sides. Real sugar, she said, handing them each a glass. None of that artificial stuff. My Harold always said life's too short for fake sugar. Grace took a sip, and her eyes widened. This is delicious, Mrs. Caldwell. Call me Dot, honey. Everyone does. Dorothea's eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled. That barn's been in need of attention for too long now. My Harold used to keep it up, but since he passed. She paused, her hand unconsciously touching the wedding ring she still wore. Well, things tend to slip away when you're not looking. Eli nodded, understanding in his eyes. We'll get it looking right again, Mrs. Caldwell. Dot, I brought all the supplies we talked about. Should be able to start with the scraping today. No rush, Dorothea said, but Eli could see the worry in the way she looked at the barn. That old building's held a lot of stories over the years, seen good times and bad, harvest celebrations, winter storms, even a wedding once. Grace pulled her sketchbook closer, her pencil moving across the page. Could you tell us about the wedding? Dorothea laughed, a sound like wind chimes. Another time, dear. Your father's got work to do, and this heat isn't getting any lighter. She stood, straightening her apron. Tools are in the shed there, Eli. Ladder too. You need anything, you just holler. Eli finished his tea and stood, rolling up his sleeves. The morning was already warm, promising a hot day ahead. He retrieved the ladder and tools from the shed, the familiar weight of the scraper in his hand bringing back memories of similar jobs. Grace had settled herself under a sprawling maple tree, her pencil dancing across the paper as she sketched the barn. The ladder creaked as Eli climbed, each rung solid despite its age. The old red paint was flaking badly in spots, curling away from the wood like autumn leaves. He positioned himself carefully and began to scrape, falling into the rhythm of the work. Scrape, brush away, move over a few inches. Repeat. The sun climbed higher, and Eli worked his way across the wall, stopping occasionally to wave at Grace or accept another glass of tea from Dorothea, who kept watch from her porch like a guardian angel. The work was honest, simple, the kind that let his mind quiet down, away from the stack of bills waiting at home. Just before noon, as he reached a section near the hayloft, his scraper hit a board that sounded different. The hollow sound made him pause. He tapped it again with the handle of the scraper, listening to the strange echo. Most of the boards rang solid when struck, but this one was different. The late afternoon sun slanted through the barn's weathered slats, creating golden beams that caught the dust motes dancing in the air. Eli stood on the old wooden ladder, his paint scraper forgotten in his hand as he studied the peculiar plank that had made that hollow sound. Years of working maintenance had taught him to trust his instincts about buildings, and something about this board didn't feel right. "Miss Caldwell," he called down to where Dorothea stood watching him work. "Mind if I check something up here?" Dorothea shielded her eyes against the sunlight streaming through the barn door. "Of course not, dear. And please, call me Dot." Grace looked up from where she sat, cross-legged on a hay bale, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. "What is it, Dad?" "Not sure yet, honey." Eli ran his callous fingers along the edge of the plank. It was slightly loose at one end, different from the others. He worked the scraper carefully into the gap, not wanting to damage anything. The old wood groaned in protest. "Be careful up there," Dorothea called, her voice carrying a hint of worry. "That ladder's seen better days." "Yes, ma'am," Eli replied, fully focused on his task. He'd learned patience in the army. Rushing things usually meant mistakes, and mistakes could be costly. The plank shifted slightly under his careful pressure, a few more gentle prods, and suddenly the board came loose with a soft creak. Eli steadied himself on the ladder as dust and debris scattered down. Behind the plank was a dark cavity in the wall. "There's something in here," he said, reaching carefully into the space. His fingers brushed against fabric, something soft and quilted. He could feel shapes wrapped inside, like rolled tubes. Grace stood up, her sketchbook forgotten. "What is it? Hand me that flashlight from my toolbox, would you, sweetheart?" Grace hurried over to his red metal toolbox and retrieved the flashlight, passing it up to him. Eli clicked it on and shone it into the cavity. The beam revealed several fabric-wrapped bundles tucked away in the wall space. "Miss Caldwell, Dot, I think you might want to see this," Eli said, carefully pulling out the first bundle. It was surprisingly heavy, wrapped in what appeared to be an old handmade quilt, faded but still beautiful in its intricate pattern. Dorothea moved closer, her eyes wide with curiosity. "My word," she breathed. "I've never seen that quilt before, and I thought I knew every inch of this old barn." Eli descended the ladder slowly, holding the bundle against his chest. The fabric had a musty smell, but beneath that was something else, the sharp scent of old oil paint. He set it down gently on a nearby workbench. "There are more up there," he said, glancing back at the opening. "At least 3 or 4 from what I could see." Grace approached the bundle, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Can we open it?" Dorothea nodded, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she reached for the quilt's folded edges. "Careful now," she murmured. "Whatever's in here, it's been hidden away for a long time." Together, they slowly unwrapped the quilt. The fabric fell away to reveal several canvases, rolled tightly and bound with faded ribbon. Eli carefully untied the first one, and with gentle movements, began to unroll it. The canvas crackled slightly as it opened, but the painted surface appeared intact. As the image emerged, all 3 of them fell silent. It was a church scene, but unlike any painting Eli had ever seen. The colors were vibrant and alive, seeming to pulse with an inner light. The small white church stood against a backdrop of storm clouds, but a shaft of golden sunlight broke through, illuminating the steeple. Around the church, figures moved in what appeared to be a celebration or gathering, their faces full of joy and movement. "Oh my!" Dorothea gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my goodness!" Eli stared at the painting, momentarily forgetting about the ladder, the peeling paint, and all his worries. There was something about the way the artist had captured the light, the way the brushstrokes seemed to dance across the canvas. Even Grace, who usually couldn't sit still, stood transfixed. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the bottom corner. "There's something written there." Eli leaned in closer, squinting at the faded signature. The letters were elegant but clear. J. Delaney. Dorothea's sharp intake of breath made both Eli and Grace look up. The older woman's face had gone pale, her eyes wide with recognition. "That name?" she said softly. "I haven't heard it in. It must be 50 years. Eli carefully set the canvas aside, his mind spinning with questions. The bundle of paintings felt heavier now, weighted with mystery and possibility. His day of painting the barn had turned into something else entirely, though he wasn't sure what yet. The sunset painted streaks of orange across the sky as Eli carefully carried the wrapped canvas into Willow Bend's small brick library. The place was nearly empty at this hour, with just a few patrons browsing the shelves in the dying light. The quiet buzz of fluorescent lights filled the air. May Whitaker sat at her desk, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, and she was sorting through a stack of return books with methodical precision. She looked up as Eli approached, her eyes curious behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "Eli Mercer," she said warmly. "This is unexpected. Grace isn't with you tonight?" "No, she's at home doing homework." Eli shifted the wrapped canvas in his arms. "Miss Whitaker, I need your help with something if you have a minute." May pushed her chair back and stood. "Of course, and please, it's just May. What have you got there?" Eli glanced around the quiet library. "Is there somewhere more private we could talk?" May's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "We can use the reference room. Nobody's in there this time of day." She led him through the stacks to a small room lined with encyclopedias and reference materials. Once inside, Eli carefully laid the wrapped canvas on a large oak table. His rough hands seemed out of place against the delicate wrapping. "I found this today, along with others, hidden in Dorothea Caldwell's barn. We thought you might know something about them." May's careful movements as she unwrapped the quilted covering showed years of handling delicate materials. When she finally pulled back the last layer, her breath caught audibly. The painting depicted a small country church, its white steeple piercing a storm-dark sky. But it was the way the artist had captured the light golden rays breaking through ominous clouds that made the scene almost luminous. "Oh my," May whispered, leaning closer. Her fingers hovered over the canvas without touching it. "The technique here, the use of light." She reached for her glasses and slipped them on, bending to examine the bottom corner. "There's a signature. J. Delaney." She straightened up so quickly, Eli took a step back. "That name means something to you?" May's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. "Josiah Delaney. There were always rumors, whispers really, about a brilliant artist who passed through here in the early 1950s, a black man who created incredible works but couldn't get them shown in galleries." She moved to a filing cabinet in the corner and began rifling through it. "I've collected every scrap of information I could find about him over the years." Eli watched as she pulled out a thin folder. "You think this might be his work?" "The timing would fit." May spread several yellowed newspaper clippings on the table beside the painting. Delaney disappeared sometime around 1952. Some said he went north, others thought he died, but there were always stories about a collection of paintings that vanished with him. She looked up at Eli, her eyes bright with excitement. "How many more did you find?" "At least a dozen, maybe more. All wrapped in quilts, hidden behind a wall panel." Eli ran a hand through his hair. "There were letters too, signed with the same name." May's fingers pressed against her lips. "Letters? In his own hand?" She turned back to the painting, studying it with renewed intensity. The brushwork, the composition, it all fits what was described in the old articles. "And look here." She pointed to a subtle pattern worked into the church's foundation stones. "That's a quilt pattern, the North Star. It was used on the Underground Railroad to guide people to freedom." Eli leaned closer, seeing the deliberate geometric shapes May was indicating. "You're saying these paintings, they're more than just art, Eli. They're history, hidden history." May's voice had dropped to an almost reverent whisper. "If these are authentic Delaney works, they're invaluable, not just in terms of money, but as cultural artifacts. Documentation of a time and place that many tried to erase." She straightened up and met his eyes. "If this is real, Eli, you've found something priceless." Eli drove home with his heart pounding, May's words echoing in his mind. The darkened streets of Willow Bend seemed different somehow, as if the weight of history he'd stumbled upon had changed even the familiar route home. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, thinking of Grace waiting at home, of all those bills piled on the kitchen counter, and of the treasure hidden in Dorothea's barn that might change everything. Morning sunlight streamed through the weathered windows of Dorothea's farmhouse kitchen, casting warm squares on the worn wooden table. The aroma of fresh coffee and buttermilk biscuits filled the air. Eli sat across from Dorothea, his work-roughened hands wrapped around a steaming mug decorated with faded flowers. "Now, Eli," Dorothea began, her steel gray hair neatly pinned back, "I've been thinking all night about these paintings." She smoothed her apron with practiced hands. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing you here to find them." Eli nodded, taking a careful sip of his coffee. The bitter warmth helped chase away the exhaustion from a sleepless night, spent wondering about the painting's worth. "I want to make you a proper offer," Dorothea continued, her voice steady and clear. "If these paintings are worth anything and May seems to think they are, I believe we should split whatever comes of them." She reached across the table and patted his hand. "Half for you and Grace, half for preserving this farm's history." Eli's throat tightened. He set down his mug, trying to keep his hands from trembling. "Mrs. Caldwell, Dorothea, please," she insisted, her eyes kind but firm. "And don't you dare argue with me about this. You found them, and I can see in your eyes how much you and that sweet girl of yours need a blessing." The morning light caught the silver threads in her hair, making them shine like a crown. Her face held the dignified grace of someone who had weathered many storms, but kept her compassion intact. "I know what it's like," she continued, her voice softening. "Raising a child alone, watching every penny, worried sick about the future." She stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the barn where the paintings lay hidden. "My Herbert and I struggled plenty in our early years, but people helped us, showed us kindness when we needed it most." Eli followed her gaze to the barn, its red paint peeling, its frame still proud against the morning sky. "It's more than generous," he managed to say. "But are you sure? These paintings belong to your farm, and they'll still be part of this farm story." Dorothea turned back to him, her expression resolute. "But stories are meant to be shared, Eli. They're meant to help people." She returned to her chair, settling into it with purpose. "Besides, I've been praying for a way to preserve this place, to keep its history alive. Maybe this is the answer to both our prayers." The weight that had been pressing on Eli's chest for months, years, really began to lift slightly. He thought of Grace's asthma medications, the pile of unpaid bills on his kitchen counter, the repairs his truck desperately needed. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Say you'll accept." Dorothea smiled, pushing a plate of biscuits toward him. "And eat something. You're too thin." Eli couldn't help but chuckle, taking a biscuit. It was still warm, crumbling perfectly between his fingers. "Yes, ma'am," he said, managing a smile of his own. They spent the next hour discussing practical matters: how to properly document the paintings, who to contact for appraisals, how to keep them safe until then. Dorothea's organizational skills matched her compassion, and by the time Eli left to pick up Grace from school, they had a solid plan in place. That evening, Eli stood at his own stove, stirring a pot of mac and cheese, Grace's favorite comfort food. The kitchen was small, nothing like Dorothea's farmhouse space, but it was clean and warm with the last rays of sunset streaming through the window over the sink. Grace sat at their small table, her math homework spread out before her, dark hair falling forward as she worked through problems. Her inhaler lay within easy reach, a constant reminder of why they needed this chance so desperately. "How about we take a homework break?" Eli suggested, dividing the mac and cheese between two bowls. He added extra cheese to Grace's portion, just the way she liked it. Grace pushed aside her textbook, making room for the bowl. "Thanks, Dad." She took a bite, then studied his face carefully. "You look different today. Did something good happen?" Eli sat down across from her, just as he had sat across from Dorothea that morning. But this time, instead of receiving hope, he was giving it. "You know those paintings we found in Mrs. Caldwell's barn?" Grace nodded, her eyes brightening with interest. She'd been fascinated by the discovery, spending hours sketching copies of the paintings in her notebook. "Well, Mrs. Caldwell, Dorothea, she's offered to split whatever they're worth with us, half and half." He watched as understanding dawned on his daughter's face. "If they're really valuable, like May thinks they might be, we might finally catch a break." Grace's smile bloomed slowly, like sunshine breaking through clouds. The faith shining in her eyes made his heart swell. She didn't ask for specifics or guarantees. She didn't need to. His daughter had always been able to see hope where others might miss it, just like she saw beauty in her drawings that others might overlook. The gravel crunched under expensive tires as a sleek black Mercedes pulled into the Caldwell Farms driveway. The morning sun glinted off its polished surface, creating a stark contrast against the weathered barn and humble farmhouse. Inside the kitchen, Rosa Alvarez paused in her dish drying, her shoulders tensing at the sound of the approaching vehicle. Dorothea Caldwell stood from her rocking chair on the porch, smoothing her cotton dress with dignified calm. She'd known this visit was coming. Martin Voss stepped out of his car with the practiced grace of someone who made grand entrances for a living. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit crisp despite the summer heat. "Mrs. Caldwell," he called out, his voice carrying the warmth of a practiced salesman. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Eli, who had been preparing to start another day of work on the barn, watched from near the water pump, paintbrush still in hand. He noticed how Rosa moved to stand in the kitchen doorway, her young son Luis peeking out from behind her skirt. "Mr. Voss," Dorothea responded, her tone polite but reserved. "What brings you out to my farm today?" Voss climbed the porch steps, reaching into his suit jacket to produce a folder. "I've been thinking about our previous discussions, and I believe I have an offer that will make you very happy." His smile showed perfect white teeth, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I've already told you, Mr. Voss, this farm isn't for sale. Dorothea's voice carried the quiet strength of old oak trees. Now, Mrs. Caldwell? Voss spread his hands in what seemed like genuine concern. You must think about the future. This property has so much potential. My development would bring jobs, tourism, progress to Willowbend. Rose's fingers tightened on the dish towel she was holding. She'd seen too many families in her old neighborhood pushed out by similar promises of progress. The future I'm thinking about, Dorothea replied, is preserving what matters. This land has stories worth keeping. Voss's pleasant expression flickered for just a moment. Stories don't pay property taxes, Mrs. Caldwell, or maintain aging buildings. He gestured toward the barn where Eli stood. I couldn't help but notice you're having work done. Maintenance costs must be significant. Eli shifted uncomfortably, aware of the precious secret hidden within those barn walls. He watched as Louise slipped away from his mother's side, drawn by curiosity toward the well-dressed stranger. My finances are my concern, Dorothea stated firmly. And this farm is not for sale at any price. Voss's smile tightened. Everything has a price, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm prepared to be very generous. He opened his folder, pulling out papers filled with numbers. This offer is well above market value. Mr. Voss, Dorothea began, but he continued speaking over her. Think about it. You could live comfortably anywhere you choose. No more worrying about repairs, property taxes, or maintaining all this. He waved his hand dismissively at the surrounding farm. History. Rosa stepped fully onto the porch now, protective instinct drawing her closer to Dorothea. The older woman had been kind to her, offering her steady work when others wouldn't, treating her with respect that some in town didn't show to single mothers, especially Hispanic ones. The answer is still no, Dorothea said, her voice firm but tired, as if she'd had this conversation too many times before. Voss's pleasant facade cracked slightly. Mrs. Caldwell, be reasonable. This property is falling apart. The liability alone? I believe Mrs. Caldwell has given you her answer, Eli interrupted, moving closer to the porch. He didn't like the pressure he could hear building in Voss's voice. Voss turned, seeming to notice Eli for the first time. His eyes narrowed slightly, taking in the paint-splattered clothes and worn work boots. And you are? Eli Mercer. I'm helping with the barn restoration. Ah. Voss's tone dismissed Eli as irrelevant. He turned back to Dorothea. Please, just look at these numbers. You'll see. No, Mr. Voss. Dorothea's voice had the ring of final authority. I won't be looking at any numbers. This farm stays in the family, as it has for generations. Voss's charm disappeared entirely, replaced by barely concealed frustration. He shoved the papers back into his folder with sharp movements. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Caldwell. A very expensive mistake. As he turned to leave, something unexpected happened. Little Luis, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes, stepped forward. His voice was small but clear in the sudden silence. Mommy says you're my daddy. The words hung in the air like summer lightning. Rosa gasped, her face draining of color. Dorothea's hand flew to her mouth. Eli stood frozen, paint dripping unnoticed from his brush onto his boot. Voss went completely still, his back to the group. When he turned, his face was a mask of cold anger. I don't know what you're talking about, boy. His voice was ice. Mrs. Caldwell, we'll continue this discussion another time. Without another word, he strode to his car, got in, and drove away, gravel spraying from his tires. In his wake, he left a silence as heavy as August humidity. The morning sun had barely warmed the dew on the grass when a sharp knock echoed through Dorothea's screen door. Eli looked up from where he sat at the kitchen table, going over the previous day's work notes. Through the mesh, he could see a man in an expensive suit holding a leather briefcase. Mrs. Caldwell? The lawyer's voice was crisp and professional. I'm Richard Thorne, representing Martin Voss Development Corporation. Dorothea opened the door slowly, her face composed but wary. How can I help you, Mr. Thorne? The lawyer stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the worn linoleum. His eyes swept the humble kitchen, taking in Eli's work clothes and the coffee cups on the table. Without waiting for an invitation, he placed his briefcase on the counter and snapped it open. I'm here regarding certain contractual obligations, Thorne said, pulling out a thick manila envelope. Specifically, an option agreement you signed with Mr. Voss 3 years ago. Eli watched Dorothea's face pale slightly. That was just about the possible sale of the property, she said. Nothing more. I'm afraid the contract is quite comprehensive. Thorne extracted a document, spreading it across the table. His manicured finger traced along a line of small print. Section 4.3 clearly states that upon execution of the option, All fixtures and contents of outbuildings are included in the transfer of property. Eli's stomach clenched. He stood up, moving closer to read over Dorothea's shoulder. The legal language swam before his eyes, but the meaning was becoming frighteningly clear. Mr. Voss is prepared to exercise his option immediately, Thorne continued, his tone matter-of-fact, which would include immediate rights to any items discovered within the barn structure. The paintings? Eli breathed, his voice barely audible. The hope that had been building over the past days, dreams of Grace's medical care, of stability, seemed to crumble like old paint chips. Dorothea's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her reading glasses. I didn't understand this part. He said it was just a standard form. Nevertheless, you signed it, Mrs. Caldwell. Thorne placed another document on the table. Mr. Voss is willing to be generous in expediting the process. This offer includes a substantial bonus above the original agreed-upon price. The screen door creaked, and Rosa entered carrying a basket of fresh laundry. She froze at the tension in the room, her dark eyes taking in the scene. We'll need our lawyer to review this, Dorothea said firmly, though Eli could hear the slight quaver in her voice. Of course. Thorne's smile didn't reach his eyes. But I should mention that any attempt to remove or conceal items from the barn during this process would constitute a breach of contract. He reached into his briefcase again, which brings me to this temporary restraining order. Eli sank back into his chair, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He thought of Grace's face yesterday, so full of hope when he'd hinted at better times ahead. Now it felt like he'd failed her again. After the lawyer left, the kitchen remained silent except for the old clock ticking on the wall. Rosa put down her laundry basket and moved to make fresh coffee, her movements deliberately calm. I should have read it more carefully, Dorothea said softly, still staring at the papers. Martin was so pleasant back then, talking about preserving the historical character of the area. Eli rubbed his rough hands across his face. There has to be something we can do. Those paintings, they're part of history. They don't belong in some developer's private collection. Rosa paused in measuring the coffee ground. Perhaps. She hesitated, then continued. Perhaps it would help to know more about how they came to be here? Dorothea looked up. What do you mean? Rosa wiped her hands on her apron. Last night, I was looking through some of the letters we found with the paintings. There was one. She left the kitchen briefly, returning with a yellowed envelope. This one mentioned my Tío Miguel. Eli took the fragile paper carefully. The handwriting was faded but clear, dated 1952. As he read aloud, his voice grew stronger with each line. My dear friend, I cannot thank Miguel enough for his help in securing these works. When the gallery rejected them for being too controversial, too honest about our community's struggles, I feared they would be destroyed. Your brother's courage in helping me hide them here, where they might someday be found by those who understand their true worth, gives me hope. Let history remember that Miguel Ramirez stood for truth when others would hide it. Yours sincerely, Josiah Delaney. Eli looked up at Rosa, seeing her in a new light. Your great-uncle helped hide these paintings? Rosa nodded, tears shining in her eyes. Tío Miguel used to tell stories about a brave artist who painted what others were afraid to show. I never knew. She touched the letter gently. I never knew he helped save the paintings. Dorothea reached across the table to grasp Rosa's hand. Then you're part of this too. Your family helped protect these paintings when they needed protection most. A warm breeze rustled through the screen door, carrying the scent of summer flowers. In that moment, despite the legal threats hanging over them, Eli felt something shift. The paintings weren't just valuable art anymore. They were a legacy of courage, connecting the past to the present through bonds of family and truth. Voss can waive all the contracts he wants, Dorothea said, her voice stronger now. But he can't erase the history of how these paintings came to be here, or the people who protected them. Rosa carefully folded the letter, her movements reverent. My son should know this story, she said quietly. Luis should know his family stood for something important. Eli looked at the legal papers spread across the table, then at the precious letter in Rosa's hands. The path ahead might be difficult, but now they knew they weren't just fighting for valuable paintings. They were fighting for a shared history that deserved to be preserved. The morning after the lawyer's visit brought an unexpected sight to the Caldwell farm. A line of cars stretched down the dirt driveway, kicking up clouds of dust in the early light. Women from the First Baptist Church stepped out carrying wicker baskets filled with cleaning supplies and fresh-baked cookies. Behind them, pickup trucks rumbled in with retired veterans from the local VFW post. We heard about the paintings, Mrs. Peterson announced, her gray hair neatly pinned back. She clutched a stack of soft quilts to her chest. And about that awful man trying to take them. "We're here to help." Eli stood on the barn's wooden steps, overwhelmed by the show of support. Grace peeked around him, her eyes wide with wonder at the growing crowd. "I brought my special wood polish," Rosa said, emerging from the house with a tin of beeswax and a stack of soft cloths. "For the frames, my grandmother's recipe." The barn became a hive of activity. Church ladies spread quilts on hay bales, carefully laying out the paintings for cleaning. Their experienced hands worked with gentle determination, using soft brushes to whisk away decades of dust. The air filled with the smell of lemon oil and furniture polish. "My daddy was a frame maker," Mrs. Jenkins said, showing Grace how to apply Rosa's polish in small circles. "You want to treat the wood like it's precious, because it is." Outside, veterans set up a rotation schedule for night watches. Pete Anderson, who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, organized them with military precision. "Nobody's going to mess with these paintings on our watch," he declared, his weathered face serious. Grace worked alongside Rosa, their hands moving in rhythm as they brought dull wood back to life. "Look how it shines now," Grace whispered, holding up a freshly polished frame to catch the light streaming through the barn doors. Rosa smiled, her eyes soft with memory. "My Tio, my great-uncle, he would have loved to see this. He believed in protecting beautiful things." The day moved forward in a blur of activity. Women shuttled between the house and barn with plates of sandwiches and pitchers of sweet tea. Veterans walked the perimeter, discussing security measures and installation of motion lights. The paintings seemed to glow brighter with each gentle cleaning, their colors emerging like spring flowers after a long winter. "These aren't just paintings anymore," Dorothea observed, watching the community work. "They're bringing people together." By mid-afternoon, the transformation was remarkable. The barn's interior had been swept clean, its walls lined with carefully arranged artwork. Each painting had been lovingly restored, each frame polished to a warm gleam. Even the air felt different, charged with purpose and pride. Mrs. Peterson organized a prayer circle before people began heading home. They stood in a wide ring, hands joined, voices rising in, thanks for the treasure in their midst. Grace squeezed Rosa's hand on one side and Eli's on the other, feeling the strength of connection flow between them. As the sun began its descent, the crowd thinned. Pete and his veterans took up their first watch positions, thermoses of coffee at the ready. The last of the church ladies packed up their cleaning supplies, leaving behind the sweet scent of lemon and promise. Eli and Grace started their walk home, their fingers intertwined. The evening air was soft around them, carrying the sounds of crickets and distant barking dogs. Grace's other hand clutched a paper bag of leftover cookies from Mrs. Peterson. They moved slowly, tired but content. Grace swung their joined hands slightly, humming a hymn from the prayer circle. Eli looked down at his daughter, seeing hope bright in her eyes despite her fatigue. Behind them, the barn stood as a beacon in the growing dusk. Light spilled from its windows where Pete had installed temporary work lamps, and the silhouettes of the guards moved across the warm glow. The community's love and protection wrapped around the treasure within like a quilt, keeping it safe as night approached. The old barn doors groaned open as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Strings of white fairy lights twinkled overhead, transforming the weathered building into something magical. The sweet sound of Amazing Grace drifted from a portable speaker someone had set up in the corner, the hymn's familiar notes filling the evening air. Eli stood near the entrance, his work shirt freshly pressed despite the long day of preparation. Grace stayed close to his side, wearing her Sunday dress and practically bouncing with excitement as neighbors filed in. The paintings, now cleaned and properly displayed on easels borrowed from the high school art department, lined the barn's walls in neat rows. "Would you look at that?" Mrs. Peterson whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief as she gazed at a painting of children playing in front of an old church. "That's the First Baptist, back when my mama was just a girl." Pastor Harlan moved slowly from piece to piece, his hands clasped behind his back. "The spirit of our town," he said, nodding thoughtfully, "captured in oils and canvas." Rosa and Luis worked their way through the crowd, offering paper plates of cookies and cups of lemonade. Luis had polished his best shoes for the occasion, and his mother wore a pressed blue dress that made her look younger, prouder somehow. "The frame's cleaned up real nice," Rosa told everyone who stopped to admire the artwork. "My grandmother's polish recipe, it brings out the wood's natural shine." Dorothea sat in her favorite wooden chair near the center of the barn, holding court like a queen on her throne. Her eyes sparkled as she greeted each visitor, telling the story of finding the treasure again and again. "To think they were here all along," she kept saying, "just waiting to be discovered." The veterans who had volunteered as security stood at attention near the doors and windows, their presence both protective and dignified. Mr. Jenkins, who had served in Vietnam, touched the corner of one frame with reverence. "This here," he said, pointing to a painting of farmers bringing in a harvest. "This is what we fought for. Simple moments like these." Grace tugged at Eli's sleeve, pointing to a woman in a tailored suit who was studying each painting with intense focus, making notes in a small, leather-bound notebook. "Who's that, Dad?" she whispered. Before Eli could answer, May from the library hurried over, practically vibrating with excitement. "That's Dr. Sarah Chin from the Regional Art Museum," she explained in a hushed voice. "I invited her. She specializes in forgotten American artists." Eli's heart began to race as Dr. Chen made her way toward them. She had the careful movements of someone used to handling precious things, and her eyes were bright with professional interest. "Mr. Mercer?" She extended her hand. "I'm Sarah Chin. I wonder if we might talk about these remarkable pieces." Eli wiped his palm on his pants before shaking her hand. "Of course, ma'am. These works are extraordinary," she said, flipping through her notes. "The technique, the historical documentation of rural life, the preservation quality, it's all remarkable. Our museum would be very interested in featuring them in a special exhibition." The conversation around them quieted as people noticed Dr. Chin speaking with Eli. Dorothea wheeled her chair closer, and Rosa stepped forward, still holding her tray of cookies. "A museum exhibition?" Dorothea asked, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Chin nodded enthusiastically. "With your permission, we'd like to create a traveling exhibit. These paintings tell an important story about American life, about community and perseverance. They deserve to be seen." Grace grabbed Eli's hand and squeezed it tight. He could feel her practically vibrating with excitement. "People would come from all over to see them?" Luis asked, his eyes wide. "Oh yes." Dr. Chen smiled at him. "We would provide proper security, insurance, and, of course, full credit to the Caldwell farm and everyone involved in their discovery and preservation." The barn hummed with excited whispers. Mrs. Peterson was crying again, and Pastor Harlan had his arm around Dorothea's shoulders. Even the veteran seemed to stand a little straighter. May clutched her research papers to her chest. "Just think, Josiah Delaney's work, finally getting the recognition it deserves." Rosa touched one of the frames she had lovingly polished. "My great-uncle helped hide these," she said softly. "He knew they were important." "We'll need time to consider the details," Eli said carefully, thinking of Voss's threats and the legal complications. But he couldn't help smiling as he looked around at his neighbors' shining faces. The fairy lights twinkled overhead, and a new hymn began to play, "How Great Thou Art." The paintings seemed to glow in the gentle light, each one a window into their town's past, each one a piece of their shared story. Dr. Chin pulled out her business card. "Please, take your time, but know that we would be honored to share these treasures with the world." The excitement in the barn was palpable. As Grace hugged Eli's waist, he realized that what they had found was more than just valuable art. It was a piece of history that belonged to all of them, a legacy worth protecting. Morning dew clung to the grass as Eli's truck rattled up the gravel driveway to Dorothea's farm. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. He'd gotten into the habit of arriving early to check on the paintings before starting his regular maintenance work. Something fluttered in the crisp morning breeze. Eli's steps slowed as he approached the barn. 3 white pieces of paper had been nailed to the wooden doors, the edges rippling in the wind. His throat tightened as he drew closer. In bold black marker, someone had written, "This doesn't belong to you." Eli's hand shook slightly as he pulled the first note down, then the second and third. The nails had been driven in deep, leaving ugly holes in the weathered wood. He stuffed the papers in his pocket just as the sound of tires on gravel made him turn. Rosa's old sedan pulled up, Luis in the passenger seat clutching his trumpet case. She took one look at Eli's face and knew something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, hurrying over while Luis headed inside to practice. The boy had been coming early to play music in the barn, saying the acoustics were perfect. Eli showed her the notes. Rosa's face paled as she read them, her fingers crumpling the paper's edges. "We should call the police," she said quietly. "And tell them what? That someone left mean notes?" Eli ran a hand through his hair. "They'll just say it's not a crime." "But it's a threat," Rosa insisted. She glanced toward the barn where Luis's trumpet scales could be heard, muffled but clear. "First the paintings, now this. What's next?" Eli began filling the nail holes with wood putty from his toolbox. "I'll talk to the veterans about increasing security watches. Maybe we can set up some cameras." Rosa wrapped her arms around herself, though the morning wasn't particularly cold. "It's Voss," she said. "It has to be. Ever since Louise." Her voice trailed off. The trumpet music stopped. Through the barn's window, they could see Luis carefully cleaning his instrument, totally absorbed in the task. The sight seemed to give Rosa strength and pain in equal measure. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About Luis and Martin Voss." Eli set down his putty knife and gave her his full attention. Rosa's eyes remained fixed on her son through the window. "I worked for Martin's family when I first came to town," she began. "I was young, naive. He was." She shook her head. "It doesn't matter what he was. What matters is that when I told him I was pregnant, he said he'd destroy my reputation if I ever told anyone. Said no one would believe me anyway." Eli's jaw tightened. "That's why you left town for those years." Rosa nodded. "My sister in Arizona took me in, but when Luis was 7, she got sick. I had nowhere else to go but back here." She finally looked at Eli, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Dorothea gave me a job, no questions asked. She saved us." The morning sun had risen higher, warming the cool air. Luis's trumpet music resumed, a hesitant melody that grew stronger with each note. "Now Luis knows," Rosa continued, her voice trembling. "I never meant for him to find out like this. I never meant for him to say anything. But he did, and now—" She pressed her fingers to her lips. "Voss will use this against us. He'll say I'm lying to get money from him. He'll make Luis testify. He'll destroy everything we've built here." Eli placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We won't let that happen. You don't know him like I do," Rosa said. "He has lawyers, money, power. And what do we have? Some paintings in a barn that he's already trying to take away." Luis's music swelled, hitting a clear, perfect note that hung in the morning air. The sound seemed to straighten Rosa's spine, lift her chin. "My son is good," she said fiercely. "He's talented and kind and everything his father isn't. But Voss will try to take that away too. He'll try to make Luis doubt himself, doubt me, doubt everything." "Then we'll fight him," Eli said firmly. "All of us. Together." Rosa wiped quickly at her eyes. "I should get to work. Dorothea will be expecting her breakfast soon." She started to turn away, then stopped. "Eli, thank you for listening, for understanding. That's what family does," he replied. "And whether Voss likes it or not, that's what we've become here." Rosa managed a small smile before heading toward the house. Eli watched her go, the crumpled notes still in his pocket, feeling heavier than paper should. Above him, a cloud passed over the sun, casting the barn in temporary shadow. But Luis's music continued to soar, defiant and beautiful in the morning light. The late afternoon sun painted golden streaks through the barn's weathered boards as townspeople filed in for the preview event. Dorothea had transformed the space with twinkling strings of lights draped from the rafters, creating a warm glow that highlighted the artwork displayed on makeshift easels. Grace sat near the front, her dark curls neatly brushed, wearing her best blue dress. She watched as Luis nervously adjusted his sheet music on the small wooden stand. His trumpet gleamed under the lights, a gift from his music teacher who'd been moved by his natural talent. "You'll do great," Grace whispered, giving him an encouraging smile. Luis nodded, his fingers fidgeting with the trumpet's valves. The barn slowly filled with familiar faces, Pastor Harlan and his wife May, from the library clutching her research notes, and what seemed like half the congregation from First Baptist. The wooden benches creaked under their weight, the excited murmur of conversation filling the air. Dorothea stood at the front, her silver hair styled carefully, wearing a pressed floral dress she saved for special occasions. Her eyes sparkled as she surveyed the growing crowd. Eli noticed how she stood straighter, years seeming to fall away as she prepared to address their neighbors. "Welcome, everyone." Dorothea's voice carried clearly through the barn. "We're here to celebrate something extraordinary, not just these beautiful paintings, but the spirit of our community." She gestured to the artwork surrounding them. "Josiah Delaney's work tells our story, our churches, our farms, our people. And now, we get to share it with all of you." The crowd nodded appreciatively, several older members dabbing at their eyes. Dorothea turned to Luis with a gentle smile. "Luis has prepared something special for us tonight." Luis raised his trumpet with trembling hands. The first few notes of Amazing Grace wavered slightly, but as he continued playing, his confidence grew. The pure, clear tones filled the barn, weaving between the paintings like a thread of gold. Grace swayed gently to the music, her face glowing with pride for her friend. When the last note faded, there was a moment of hushed silence before the crowd burst into enthusiastic applause. Luis's cheeks flushed with pleasure as several people called out, "Bravo!" The evening continued with May sharing her discoveries about Delaney's history in the area. Church ladies served homemade cookies and lemonade while people moved between the paintings, discussing their favorites. Children ran between the benches, their laughter mixing with the general cheer. Eli stood near the back, watching Grace show Louise her sketches of the paintings. His chest felt full, seeing her so happy and at ease. For the first time in years, he could imagine a future where they weren't just scraping by. The comfortable atmosphere shifted as Martin Voss's polished figure appeared in the doorway. He moved through the crowd with practiced smoothness, nodding to people as he passed. Eli tensed as Voss approached him, noting the calculated smile on the developer's face. "Quite a turnout," Voss said, his voice pitched to carry just far enough. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Mercer, one that could benefit everyone." The nearby conversations quieted as people turned to listen. Voss continued, "I'm prepared to offer a generous buyout. The collection would be featured prominently in my new development's cultural center. You'd receive a house in the new subdivision, 3 bedrooms, modern amenities, a college scholarship fund for Grace." He paused meaningfully. "And enough money to ensure you never have to worry about medical bills again." The offer hung in the air like honey, sweet and sticky. Eli could feel the weight of eyes on him, could sense the momentary temptation of such security. He looked across the barn at Grace, still sitting with Louise, both children watching with wide eyes. "That's quite an offer, Mr. Voss," Eli said slowly, his voice steady. "But these paintings don't belong in a fancy development. They belong here, where they were created, where they tell our story." He straightened his shoulders. "The answer is no." A ripple of approval moved through the crowd. Someone started clapping, and soon the applause spread through the barn like wildfire. Dorothea beamed from her place near the front, and Grace's face lit up with pride. Voss's smile tightened at the edges. He adjusted his expensive tie, cleared his throat. "You might want to reconsider. Think about your daughter's future." "I am thinking about her future," Eli replied firmly, "and about what these paintings mean to everyone here. Some things are worth more than money, Mr. Voss." The applause grew louder, punctuated by cheers and words of support. Voss's facade cracked slightly as he looked around at the united front of townspeople. Without another word, he turned and strode out of the barn, the sound of celebration following him into the evening air. The acrid smell of smoke jolted Eli from his sleep. Something was wrong. He stumbled to his window, his heart stopping at the orange glow on the horizon. It was coming from the direction of Dorothea's farm. "Grace!" he called out, already pulling on his boots. "Grace, wake up!" She appeared in her doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy? What's—" Her eyes widened as she saw the glow through the window. "Get your inhaler," Eli ordered, grabbing his truck keys. "Quick now." They raced down the stairs, Grace clutching her inhaler in one hand and holding onto the railing with the other. The night air hit them like a wall as they burst outside. Several cars were already speeding past their house toward the farm. "The paintings," Grace whispered, her voice trembling as they climbed into the truck. Eli's hand shook as he started the engine. The truck roared to life, and they sped down the dark road. Every second felt like an eternity. Through the windshield, they could see the flames reaching higher, casting an eerie orange light against the low-hanging clouds. When they arrived, the scene was chaos. Fire trucks were pulling up, their sirens wailing. People ran back and forth with buckets of water. The barn's north side was engulfed in flames, smoke billowing into the night sky. "Stay in the truck," Eli commanded Grace, but she was already out, her face pale in the firelight. "The art!" she cried. "We have to save it!" Dorothea stood in her nightgown, held back by neighbors as she tried to run toward the barn. Rosa was there too, her arms full of paintings that others had already rescued. "The north wall first!" Eli shouted to the firefighters. "That's where most of the paintings are stored." He joined a line of townspeople passing paintings out through the south entrance. Smoke stung his eyes as he worked. The heat was intense, making sweat pour down his face. Canvas after canvas was carefully handed out, some already showing signs of smoke damage. Grace stayed with Rosa, helping to lay the rescued paintings carefully on blankets that neighbors had brought. Her inhaler was clutched tight in her pocket, ready if the smoke became too much. "The self-portrait!" Dorothea called out. "Please save Josiah's self-portrait." But the flames were spreading faster now. A beam crashed down inside, sending sparks flying. The firefighters pulled everyone back, their hoses creating archives of water that seemed to have little effect on the determined fire. "3 paintings, Rosa counted, tears streaming down her face. 3 are still inside. We couldn't reach them." The crowd could only watch as the fire consumed that section of the barn. The lost artwork represented not just monetary value, but history, heritage, and hope, all going up in smoke. As the firefighters finally got the blaze under control, leaving half the barn a charred skeleton, whispers began to circulate through the crowd. Eli noticed people gathering in small clusters, heads bent together in conversation. "I saw someone near the barn earlier," a voice carried across the yard. "It was that boy, Luis." Rosa's head snapped up at the mention of her son's name. Luis stood nearby, his trumpet case clutched to his chest, eyes wide with fear. "He was practicing his trumpet by the barn this afternoon," another voice added. "I drove past and saw him." "Mama," Luis whimpered, moving closer to Rosa. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just played my music like always." But the whispers grew louder, more accusing. "Convenient timing, isn't it?" Right after Voss made his offer, Rosa wrapped her arms around Luis protectively. "My son would never," she shouted, her voice breaking. "He loves this place. He loves the art." Eli watched as tears began streaming down Luis's face. The boy buried himself in his mother's embrace as more accusations flew. Grace moved to stand beside them, her small hand finding Luis's shoulder in solidarity. The fire chief approached, his face grim. "We'll need to investigate the cause," he announced. "But right now, we need to secure what's left of the structure and the remaining artwork." Dorothea sat heavily in a lawn chair someone had brought out, staring at the smoldering barn in shock. Half of the historic structure was destroyed, along with 3 irreplaceable paintings. The rest of the collection showed varying degrees of smoke damage, the acrid smell clinging to the canvas and frame. Eli moved between the rescued paintings, assessing the damage. Some would need extensive restoration, others might never be the same. The dream of the Freedom Gallery seemed to be disappearing like smoke into the night sky. Rosa continued to hold Luis close, her tears falling into his dark hair as the accusations kept coming. "He's just a child," she pleaded to nobody in particular. "Mihijo would never destroy something so precious." The night wore on, the fire's glow gradually dying down to reveal the extent of the destruction in the growing dawn. The air was heavy with smoke, loss, and suspicion. What had started as a night of peaceful sleep had turned into a nightmare of flames and accusations, leaving their small community fractured and their hopes hanging by a thread. Morning sunlight couldn't pierce the heavy cloud of worry hanging over Willow Bend. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air as Eli walked down Main Street toward May's library. His clothes were stained with soot from the night before, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Outside Miller's General Store, a cluster of people huddled together, their voices carrying in the crisp morning air. "I heard Tommy saw that Alvarez boy hanging around the barn just before sunset," Mrs. Peterson whispered loudly enough for Eli to hear. "Wouldn't surprise me," another voice chimed in. Those people? Eli stopped in his tracks, his hands clenching into fists. "You mean the family that's lived here and worked honest jobs longer than most of us?" The group scattered like startled birds, but their whispers followed him down the street. Outside the diner, he spotted Rosa wiping tables through the window. Her shoulders were tight with tension, her movements mechanical. Luis sat in a corner booth, his trumpet case clutched to his chest like a shield. Eli pushed open the door, the bell's cheerful jingle, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere inside. Rosa looked up, relief washing over her tired face. "Mr. Mercer?" she said softly, clutching her cleaning rag. "They're saying such terrible things." "I know, Rosa." Eli pulled out a chair at the nearest table. "Sit down for a minute." She glanced nervously at the counter where her manager worked, but sat anyway. Luis remained in his corner, small and withdrawn. "Luis," Eli called gently. "Come here, son." The boy shuffled over, his eyes fixed on the floor. His trumpet case made a soft thud as he set it under the table. "I didn't do it, Mr. Mercer," Luis whispered, his voice cracking. "I promise. I was practicing my trumpet in my room all evening. Mama heard me." "I know you didn't," Eli said firmly. "And we're going to prove it." The diner's door chimed again. Martin Voss strode in, his expensive suit out of place among the vinyl booths and Formica tables. Rosa stiffened, one hand reaching protectively toward Luis. Well, Voss said, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Quite a tragedy about the barn. I heard your boy was seen in the area." Luis shrank further into himself. Rosa stood up so quickly, her chair scraped against the floor. "My son is innocent," she declared, her accent thickening with emotion. "He would never—" "The police might want to question him," Voss continued smoothly. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to handle this privately. I have considerable influence in this town." Eli rose slowly, placing himself between Voss and Rosa's family. "Are you threatening a child, Martin?" Other customers were watching now, their forks suspended halfway to their mouths. "Simply stating facts." Voss adjusted his tie. though I might be persuaded to help clear up any misunderstandings. For the right consideration. You mean, if Rosa drops the paternity issue? Eli's voice was low but carried in the hushed diner. If she lets you keep denying your own son? Color rose in Voss's face. Watch yourself, Mercer. You're not exactly in a position to make accusations. How's Grace's breathing lately? Medical bills must be mounting up. Before Eli could respond, May burst through the door, waving a paper. Eli, I found something about the night of... She stopped short at the tableau before her. This isn't over, Voss muttered, turning on his heel and striding out. The diner gradually returned to its usual breakfast chatter, but the damage was done. Rosa's manager called her back to work, shooting disapproving glances at Luis. I'll walk Luis to school, Eli offered, gathering the boy's trumpet case. May, can you hold that news until I get back? Outside, the morning had warmed, but Luis walked with his shoulders hunched against invisible cold. They passed the church where Pastor Harlan was sweeping the steps. He waved, then frowned at Luis's obvious distress. Having a rough morning? The pastor asked, leaning his broom against the railing. Luis nodded mutely. Those who trust in the Lord need fear no accusations, Pastor Harlan said gently. Truth has a way of coming to light, but what if people don't wait for the truth? Luis's voice was barely audible. What if they've already decided? Then we stand with you until they see it. Eli squeezed the boy's shoulder. Your mama, me, Grace, Dorothea, Pastor Harlan, we know who you are. They continued their walk, Luis's steps gradually becoming lighter. At the school gates, he took his trumpet case with a small smile. Thanks, Mr. Mercer. Eli watched until Luis disappeared inside, then headed back toward his truck. The morning's confrontations had drained him, and he still needed to check on Grace at home. She'd been coughing more than usual after the smoke exposure. His truck rumbled down the familiar streets of the neighborhood he'd called home for the past 3 years. Not much, but it was theirs. Or had been. The bright orange paper stuck to his front door made his stomach drop before he even read the words. The eviction notice was crisp and official, giving him 72 hours to vacate the premises or face legal action. Eli's legs felt wooden as he climbed the porch steps and tore down the notice. Through the window, he could see Grace curled up on the couch with her sketchbook, unaware that their world had just tilted again. His hands trembled as he read the detailed list of lease violations, late payments, unauthorized maintenance work, noise complaints. All minor issues his landlord had overlooked before. Now, with Voss's lawsuit hanging over the art collection, it seemed everyone was choosing sides. The screen door creaked as he pushed it open, the eviction notice heavy in his pocket. Grace looked up from her drawing, her smile fading as she saw his face. Daddy, what's wrong? Eli sat heavily on the arm of the couch, the weight of everything, the fire, Luis's persecution, and now this, pressing down on his shoulders. He stared at the worn carpet, trying to find words that wouldn't frighten his daughter. But for the first time since Sarah died, he wasn't sure how to protect her from what was coming. The church's stained glass windows cast pools of colored light across the worn wooden pews. In the hushed sanctuary, Eli Mercer sat with his head bowed, his rough hands clasped tightly together. Beside him, Grace slept curled up on the cushioned seat, her breathing slightly wheezy but steady. Her dark hair spilled across the worn velvet, and someone, probably one of the church ladies, had draped a crocheted afghan over her shoulders. The evening shadows grew longer as Eli wrestled with his conscience. In his pocket, he could feel the crumpled eviction notice that had been taped to his door that morning. The weight of it seemed to burn through the fabric of his jeans, a constant reminder of their desperate situation. He reached out and gently smoothed Grace's hair back from her face. Her inhaler lay on the pew beside her, nearly empty. The thought of not being able to afford a refill made his stomach clench. Lord, he whispered, his voice barely disturbing the silence. I don't know what to do anymore. The paintings that remained after the fire were safely locked away in May's climate-controlled archives at the library. One small piece, a sunset scene of workers in a field, would fetch enough on the black market to cover 6 months' rent and Grace's medication. The art dealer's business card felt like it was burning a hole in his wallet. One call, one painting, and their immediate problems would vanish. But it wasn't just his decision to make. The paintings belonged to the community now, to Rosa's family legacy, to Dorothea's farm's history. Yet here he sat, a father unable to provide his daughter with the basic necessities of life. Footsteps echoed in the empty church. Pastor Harlan's familiar gait, slightly uneven from an old knee injury, drew closer. Eli didn't look up as the older man settled into the pew across the aisle. Been sitting here a while, son? The pastor's voice was gentle, understanding. Eli nodded, still watching Grace sleep. Since about 4. Couldn't stay in that house anymore, staring at that notice. Pastor Harlan folded his hands in his lap. Heavy burdens you're carrying. I keep thinking about one of those paintings, Eli admitted, the words feeling like betrayal even as he spoke them. Just one, small one. Nobody would even notice it was gone, and Grace needs, son. The interruption was soft but firm. Eli finally looked up, meeting the pastor's kind eyes. The older man's face showed no judgment, only deep compassion. I was in Vietnam, Pastor Harlan said, surprising Eli with the sudden change of topic. There was this village temple filled with ancient artifacts. Some of the men talked about how easy it would be to slip a few small pieces into their packs. Nobody would miss them, they said. We could feed our families for a year. Eli's throat tightened. What happened? The village elder caught wind of it. He didn't get angry. He just gathered us all together and said something I've never forgotten. These aren't just objects. They're the story of my people. Each piece carries the dreams of generations. Pastor Harlan's voice grew softer. What you found in that barn, Eli, it's not just wood and paint. It's people. It's Rose's ancestors who helped hide it. It's Dorothea's family who protected it. It's Luis's future, wrapped up in proving his father's responsibility. It's Grace's pride in her daddy's integrity. The truth of those words hit Eli like a physical blow. He looked down at his sleeping daughter, remembering how her face had lit up when they first discovered the paintings, how she'd helped Rosa clean the frames, listening to stories about Rosa's great-uncle, how she'd beamed with pride when he'd refused Voss's buyout offer. Eli's voice cracked. I just want to give her a good life. You already are, Pastor Harlan said firmly, by showing her that doing the right thing matters more than money, by teaching her that community and faith can carry us through the hardest times. The colored light from the windows had shifted, painting Grace's sleeping face in soft blues and golds. She looked peaceful, trusting. The temptation to sell the painting suddenly felt like ash in Eli's mouth. Son, what you're carrying isn't just wood and paint, it's people, Pastor Harlan repeated softly. It's legacy. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains in Dorothea Caldwell's sitting room, casting delicate shadows across the faded wallpaper. Eli sat in an overstuffed armchair, watching with concern as Dorothea settled herself carefully onto her floral sofa. Her face was pale, but determination brightened her eyes. I've been foolish, she said, smoothing her gray skirt, keeping these hidden away when they might have helped from the start. She gestured to a wooden box on the coffee table between them. Eli leaned forward, his work-worn hands resting on his knees. Mrs. Caldwell, you should be resting. The doctor said, Oh, pish. Dorothea waved away his concern. I've had enough bed rest to last me a lifetime. This is more important. She opened the box, revealing a leather-bound ledger and several yellowed envelopes. These were Herbert's, my late husband's. He kept records of everything that happened on this farm. The ledger's spine crackled as she opened it, and the scent of old paper filled the air. Eli watched as her fingers, still elegant despite their arthritis, traced down a page of neat handwriting. Herbert was like that, Dorothea continued, her voice soft with memory. Meticulous about everything. Used to drive me crazy, all his note-taking and organizing. But now, she smiled, though her eyes were damp. Now I'm grateful for every word. She carefully turned to a specific page, marked with a faded ribbon. Here, September 12, 1952. Her voice grew stronger as she read. Tonight, J.D. came with Miguel Alvarez, brought paintings wrapped in quilts. J.D. insisted they must be hidden where those who deny their worth wouldn't find them. Eli straightened. Miguel Alvarez, that would be Rosa's great-uncle? Dorothea nodded. The very same. Herbert wrote everything down, including their conversation. She turned another page. Listen to this. Miguel says these paintings tell truths some want buried. J.D. Josiah says they're meant for future eyes when hearts are readier to see. The weight of history settled over the room. Eli could almost see it, two men in the dark, entrusting precious art to the shelter of the old barn's walls. There's more, Dorothea said. She pulled out a document, its edges crisp despite its age. Herbert had it notarized. Smart man, my husband, pride colored her voice. He wrote down Josiah's exact words about who the art should belong to. Eli took the paper with careful hands. The formal notary seal stood out stark against the aged paper. This art, Dorothea recited from memory, belongs to the community and the children of those who kept it safe. Herbert made sure to have witnesses sign it too, the pastor at the time, and the town clerk. She pulled out more papers, photographs, letters, careful notes about dates and times. Herbert knew someday these might matter. He believed in doing things proper and legal. Eli spread the documents on the coffee table, amazed at the detail. There were sketches of where the paintings were hidden, notes about their conditions, even descriptions of the frames. "This proves it wasn't just abandoned property," he said slowly. "Josiah Delaney meant for these paintings to stay here with the people who protected them. And with their children," Dorothea added meaningfully. "Like Luis." The morning quiet was suddenly broken by rapid footsteps on the porch. The screen door banged open, and May Whitaker burst into the room, her librarian's composure completely forgotten. Her glasses were slightly askew, and she clutched a flashlight in one hand. "Eli, Mrs. Caldwell," she had to catch her breath. "You won't believe the barn I found." She gulped air. "There's a root cellar under the barn. It's been sealed up for decades, but it's there." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the barnyard as Eli, May, and Rosa gathered around the weathered doors set into the ground. Years of grass and dirt had hidden them until May's research pointed to their existence. Eli gripped the rusted handle, muscles straining as he pulled. "Here," May said, passing him a crowbar from her canvas bag. "This might help." Her librarian's badge caught the light as she knelt beside him, holding a battery-powered lantern. Rosa stood back, wringing her hands in her apron. "My Uncle Miguel, he told stories about a hidden place," she said softly. "I always thought they were just stories to entertain us children." The crowbar creaked against decades-old metal. With a grinding sound, the lock finally gave way. Eli pulled the doors open, releasing a rush of cool, musty air. Wooden steps disappeared into darkness. "Ladies first?" Eli offered, but his slight smile made it clear he was joking. He took the lantern from May and started down, testing each step carefully. May followed, her sensible shoes clicking against the wood. Rosa came last, making the sign of the cross as she descended into the dimness. The beam from the lantern swept across stone walls and a packed earth floor. "Look," May breathed, pointing to shapes leaning against the far wall. More canvases, carefully wrapped in oilcloth and stacked together. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he set down the lantern. They'd already lost so much in the fire. What if these were damaged too? He carefully pulled back the first layer of cloth. Colors burst into life in the lantern light. A man's face looked back at them, eyes kind but determined, brushstrokes capturing dignity and hope in equal measure. "That's him," May whispered. "That's Josiah Delaney. His self-portrait. I've seen it described in articles from the time, but everyone thought it was lost." Rosa stepped closer, touching the edge of the frame reverently. He looks like my uncle described him. A good man, he always said. A man who saw truth." They found more paintings, each one preserved by the cool, dry air of the cellar. May handled them with archival gloves she'd brought, just in case. But it was the envelope, yellowed but intact, that made them all pause. "To those who find this treasure," May read aloud, her voice steady despite her excitement, "I name this collection Freedom's Harvest, for it grew from seeds of truth planted in dark times." She looked up at Eli and Rosa. "This is it. This is proof of intent." He meant these paintings to be found, to be shared. Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "My uncle, he kept this secret so well. He protected this truth. And now it's protecting you back," May said gently. She turned to another page of the letter. "Listen to this. Let these works stand as testament to those who kept faith, who helped hide these pieces when others would have destroyed them. The children of those protectors have earned their place in this legacy." Eli sat heavily on the bottom step, overwhelmed. "This changes everything. With this documentation, Voss's contract won't stand up," May finished. "Not against clear artistic intent and historical record." Rosa's shoulders straightened. "Then, perhaps it is time for other truths to be spoken clearly too." She pulled her phone from her pocket, hands steady now. "I will call my lawyer about the DNA test for Luis." Eli and May both turned to her, surprised at her sudden decision. "Are you sure?" Eli asked quietly. "You don't have to do this now." "Yes, I do." Rosa's voice was firm. "Josiah hid his art to protect truth. My uncle protected it too. Now I must protect my son's truth. Luis deserves to know his heritage. All of it." May squeezed Rosa's hand. "We'll help you. The whole town will stand with you now." They carefully documented everything in the cellar, May taking photographs while Eli made a detailed inventory. Rosa called her lawyer from the barnyard, speaking in rapid Spanish, her voice growing stronger with each word. By sunset, word had spread through town about both discoveries, the seller's treasures, and Rosa's decision. The local paper's editor cornered Voss outside his office, asking pointed questions about DNA testing. Faced with mounting public pressure and the discovery of Delaney's letter, Voss's polished facade cracked. "Fine," he snapped at the reporters gathered around him. "I'll take the test. But this changes nothing about the contract dispute." Back at the farm, Rosa received confirmation from her lawyer. She stood in the warm evening light, surrounded by friends who had become family, and felt the weight of secrets finally lifting from her shoulders. "Luis will know the truth now," she said softly to Eli. "All of it. The legacy of my uncle who protected art, and the legacy of his father who tried to hide from truth. But mostly," she smiled, "he will know the legacy of people who stand together to protect what matters." May carefully packed away Josiah's letter in an archival sleeve. The self-portrait watched over them from where they'd propped it safely against the barn wall, its subject's eyes seeming to approve of truth finally coming to light. The old courthouse's wooden benches creaked under the weight of what seemed like half of Willow Bend. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long rectangles across the worn floor. Eli tugged at his borrowed tie, the only one he owned, having gone to the pawn shop months ago for one of Grace's prescriptions. Grace sat between Rosa and Dorothea, in the front row, her inhaler clutched tight in her lap. Luis fidgeted beside his mother, uncomfortable in his Sunday suit. The boy's eyes kept darting to where Martin Voss sat with his lawyers, their expensive suits and leather briefcases marking them as outsiders in the small-town courthouse. Judge Martha Wilson adjusted her reading glasses, scanning the room with sharp eyes that had presided over local disputes for 20 years. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back severely, but there were laugh lines around her mouth that spoke of kindness beneath the stern exterior. "The court will hear arguments regarding the ownership dispute of the recently discovered Delaney art collection," she announced, her voice carrying to the back of the packed room. "Mr. Harrison, you may present your client's case." Voss's lead attorney stood, straightening his tie with manicured fingers. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of contract law. Mrs. Caldwell signed an option agreement giving Mr. Voss rights to all fixtures and contents of the farm's outbuildings upon execution of said option. The paintings were discovered in one such outbuilding, making them subject to the contract terms." The lawyer produced a document with flourish. "This agreement, properly notarized and witnessed, clearly states," "If I may, Your Honor," Dorothea's attorney, Tom Baker, interrupted. He was a local lawyer who'd known the Caldwell family for decades and had agreed to take the case for a reduced fee. The intent of that contract was specifically for farm equipment and standard barn contents, not hidden historical artifacts. "Intent is irrelevant when the contract language is clear," Harrison countered smoothly. Eli watched Dorothea's shoulders stiffen. She'd been beating herself up for weeks about signing that contract years ago when times were tough. He wished he could tell her it wasn't her fault, but here in the hushed courtroom, all he could do was pray. "Your Honor," Baker continued, "we have evidence that these artworks were never meant to be part of any modern property transaction. We have Mr. Caldwell's notarized diary and ledger detailing the night in 1952 when Josiah Delaney and Miguel Alvarez concealed these paintings." May stood from her seat, carrying forward a leather-bound book and stack of papers with careful reverence. The librarian had spent countless hours organizing and cataloging every scrap of evidence they'd found. "Furthermore," Baker said, "the recent discovery in the root cellar included letters from the artist himself, explicitly stating his wishes for the collection's future." Judge Wilson leaned forward. "Please approach with the documents." Eli held his breath as May handed over their precious evidence. The ledger's pages were yellowed but clear, Theodore Caldwell's careful handwriting recording the secret that had waited decades to be revealed. Harrison scoffed. "Convenient that these documents suddenly appeared when needed, and this root cellar found just weeks ago? It seems rather orchestrated." "The cellar's existence is documented in the original farm blueprints," May spoke up, her quiet librarian's voice steady. "I found the plans in county records from 1910. Judge Wilson held up a hand. "Miss Whitaker, please wait to be called as a witness." But her eyes lingered thoughtfully on the stack of evidence before her. Voss's lawyer pressed on. "Even if these documents are authentic, they don't override a legally binding contract. Mr. Voss has development plans that will benefit the entire community. These paintings would be properly preserved and displayed in a modern facility, away from their home," Rosa said suddenly, her voice carrying despite its softness. "Away from the people who protected them." "Mrs. Alvarez," the judge warned gently. "My apologies, Your Honor." Rosa's cheeks flushed, but she sat straighter. But my Uncle Miguel helped hide these paintings for a reason. They were meant to stay here. Eli watched Voss shift uncomfortably in his seat. The DNA results confirming Luis's parentage had come back positive just days ago, and the developer had been unusually quiet since then. His lawyers had advised against any public statements, but rumors flew through town anyway. Baker opened a folder. We have additional testimony from art historians about the collection's historical significance to this specific community. The paintings document local civil rights history, including— Objection, Harrison interrupted. The historical value isn't relevant to the contract dispute. I'll allow it, Judge Wilson said. The nature of these artifacts may bear on their legal status. For the next hour, both sides presented arguments. Eli's neck ached from tension as he watched the judge examine document after document. Grace's breathing had grown slightly wheezy from stress, and he heard her take a quiet puff from her inhaler. Finally, Judge Wilson raised her head. I've heard enough for today, but I want to review these materials thoroughly before making my decision. She held up the leather ledger. I'll study these overnight and reconvene court tomorrow morning at 9. The gavel's sharp crack made Grace jump. As people began filing out, Eli caught Dorothea's eye. The older woman's face was drawn with worry, but she managed a small smile. We've done what we can, she whispered. Now we pray. Rosa gathered Luis close, her dark eyes meeting Eli's. They both knew how much rode on tomorrow's decision, not just the paintings, but their children's futures, the town's heritage, and maybe even the beginning of healing for a family broken before it began. The autumn sun was setting as they left the courthouse, painting the sky in colors that would have inspired Josiah Delaney himself. Grace slipped her small hand into Eli's as they walked to his truck. Dad? She asked softly. What happens now? Eli squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of all their hopes pressing down. Now, sweetheart, we wait. The courthouse cafe was quiet in the late afternoon, most of the lunch crowd long gone. Sunlight slanted through dusty Venetian blinds, creating stripes across the worn Formica tables. Rosa sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her usually crisp housekeeping uniform showing wrinkles from a long day of sitting in court. Luis pressed against her side, his trumpet case propped between his feet like a shield. Eli nursed a cooling cup of coffee, watching the door. Grace had gone home with Dorothea, leaving him to support Rosa during this moment. The cafe's ancient wall clock ticked steadily, marking each heavy minute of waiting. Miss Alvarez? A court clerk appeared, clutching a manila envelope. The results you've been waiting for. Rosa's fingers trembled as she accepted the envelope. The clerk's heels clicked away across the linoleum floor, leaving them in silence. The envelope sat between them on the table like a live thing. I can't, Rosa whispered, her voice catching. Eli, would you? She pushed the envelope toward him with both hands, as if afraid it might burn her. Eli understood the weight of what she was asking. This wasn't just paper and ink. It was Luis's future, Rosa's truth, and maybe their best chance at keeping the paintings in Willow Bend. He picked up the envelope carefully, noting its official seal. You're sure? He asked gently. Rosa nodded, wrapping her arm around Luis's shoulders. The boy looked small in his borrowed suit jacket, his dark eyes huge with uncertainty. He'd been so brave through all of this. The whispers in town, the accusations about the fire, the endless questions from lawyers. Eli broke the seal slowly, trying to steady his own hands. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he pulled out the single sheet of paper. Medical terminology and percentages filled the page, but the conclusion stood out in bold text. He read it 3 times to be certain, then looked up at Rosa. It's positive, he said quietly. Luis is Martin Voss's son. Rosa closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks, but these weren't tears of shame or defeat. Eli could see the steel in her spine as she straightened up. Luis pressed closer to his mother, and she kissed the top of his head. Now everyone will know, Luis whispered. Yes, mi amor, Rosa said, her voice growing stronger. And that's okay. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Nothing. Eli watched as Rosa gathered herself, witnessed the transformation from uncertain housekeeper to fierce mother. She dabbed at her eyes with a paper napkin, then squared her shoulders. I worked for his family, she said, speaking more to Luis than to Eli. I was young and he was kind at first. When I told him about you, he pretended not to hear, offered me money to go away. Her voice hardened. But I wouldn't take it. You were worth more than his shame. Luis nodded, his eyes wet, but his chin lifted proudly. Did you love him? No, mihijo, but I love you. Every day, every moment, with all my heart. Rosa smoothed his dark hair. And now he will have to face the truth. The cafe's ancient coffee maker sputtered in the background. Outside, cars passed on the street, their drivers unaware of the life-changing moment happening inside. Eli felt like an intruder on this intimate scene, but he knew Rosa had wanted him here as a witness, as support. "What happens now?" Luis asked, looking between his mother and Eli. "Now," Rosa said, steel in her voice, "we take this to Judge Wilson. We show everyone that we have been telling the truth all along." She touched the test results, her fingers steady now. Martin Voss cannot hide anymore. Eli watched Rosa gather her purse and Luis's trumpet case, saw how she held her head high despite the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about proving paternity. It was about dignity, about standing up to power with truth as her only weapon. "Should I call May?" Eli asked, knowing the librarian had become their unofficial coordinator in this fight. "She'll want to add this to our evidence." Rosa nodded, her dark eyes clear now. "Yes. And call Pastor Harlan too. He should know his prayers for truth have been answered." Luis stood straighter, mirroring his mother's posture. Something had shifted in the boy, as if having proof of his father's identity had filled in a missing piece of himself. He picked up his trumpet case with new confidence. "Can I play at the gallery?" he asked suddenly. "When we win? I've been practicing Amazing Grace." Rosa's face softened as she looked at her son. "When we win?" she agreed, emphasizing the win. She turned to Eli, determination replacing her earlier uncertainty. "We should go. The judge will want to see this before she makes her decision." Eli gathered the test results carefully, sliding them back into the envelope. He watched Rosa lead Luis toward the cafe door, her steps sure and measured. There was no trace now of the woman who had been too afraid to open the envelope. In its place stood someone ready to fight not just for her son, but for her place in the story of Josiah's paintings, for her family's legacy. The late afternoon sun caught them as they stepped outside, turning Rosa's dark hair to copper and making Luis's eyes shine. Mother and son walked in perfect step, heading back to the courthouse where their truth would finally be heard. The morning sun streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. May Whitaker stood at the witness stand, her librarian's badge catching the light as she adjusted her reading glasses. Her usually quiet demeanor had transformed into something more commanding as she addressed the packed courtroom. "These aren't just paintings," May said, her voice clear and steady. "They're historical documents of a time when art was suppressed, when voices were silenced." She lifted one of Josiah's smaller pieces, a watercolor of children playing in front of a humble church. "Look at the detail here. The date, 1952. The same year Mr. Delaney was rejected by the Shaw Gallery for, as they put it, not fitting their aesthetic." Eli sat between Grace and Rosa in the front row, watching May handle the artwork with reverent care. His daughter leaned forward, sketching the scene in her ever-present notebook. Luis sat on Rosa's other side, his trumpet case tucked beneath the bench. Voss's lawyer stood, straightening his expensive tie. "And how does this historical significance negate my client's legal contract with Mrs. Caldwell?" May didn't flinch. "Because Mr. Delaney and Rosa's great-uncle didn't just hide these paintings. They created a trust. An informal one, yes, but with clear intent documented in multiple letters and diary entries." The judge, an older woman with silver hair and kind eyes, nodded for May to continue. "We found correspondence describing their vision for these works. They wanted them preserved until they could be shared freely, without prejudice. The barn wasn't just storage. It was meant to be a gallery someday." When May finished, Dorothea Caldwell took her place at the stand. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened her husband's leather-bound diary, but her voice rang strong and true. "My Frank wrote everything down," she said, smoothing the yellowed page. "Listen to what he recorded on September 15, 1952. Tonight, Josiah and Miguel came with precious cargo. We talked long about what it means to preserve not just paint and canvas, but hope itself. These works aren't meant for private collections or wealthy buyers. They're a legacy for the children who'll come after, proof that beauty survives even in hard times." Dorothea paused, removing her reading glasses to look directly at Voss. "That's why I can't let these paintings be locked away in some corporate showcase. They were meant for everyone." The courtroom had grown so quiet you could hear the old radiator clicking in the corner. Grace stopped sketching, her pencil hovering above the page. Luis reached for his mother's hand. Voss's lawyer produced the option contract, waving it like a flag. "Intentions aside, Mrs. Caldwell, you signed this document. It clearly states, all fixtures and contents of outbuildings become Mr. Voss's property upon execution of the sale." "A contract signed without knowledge of these specific items," Dorothea's lawyer countered, rising from his seat. "And more importantly, signed without awareness of the prior verbal trust agreement between Mr. Delaney and Miguel Alvarez, Rosa's great-uncle. The judge studied both documents, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. "I've reviewed all the evidence," she said finally, setting down the papers. "The option contract is valid for the physical structure of the barn and standard contents. However, these artworks represent something separate, a cultural and historical trust created long before Mrs. Caldwell's signature." Eli felt Grace squeeze his hand. Rosa straightened in her seat. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the documented intent of both the artist and his collaborator clearly establishes their wish for these works to benefit the community. Therefore, I'm ruling that the Josiah Delaney collection be placed in a formal trust, the Josiah Delaney Freedom Gallery, to be housed in its original location at the Caldwell farm." A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom. May smiled, clutching her research notes to her chest. Dorothea dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "The trust will be administered by a board consisting of Mrs. Caldwell, Mrs. Whitaker, and representatives from both the Town Historical Society and the arts community," the judge declared. "The barn structure itself must be restored and maintained as a proper gallery space, open to the public on a regular basis." She paused, looking directly at Voss. "This ruling does not affect the broader land negotiations between Mr. Voss and Mrs. Caldwell, which may proceed separately, but the artwork and its designated space remain protected under the trust." The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, echoing through the hushed room. "So ordered." Eli felt something inside him release, a tension he'd been carrying since that first hollow sound under his paint scraper. He looked at Grace, saw his own relief mirrored in her smile. Across the aisle, Voss sat rigid in his expensive suit, his face unreadable. May hurried over to their bench, legal pad clutched to her chest. "We did it," she whispered, her eyes bright. "The art stays home." Dorothea made her way slowly through the congratulating crowd. When she reached them, she took Eli's hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she said simply, "for finding them, for fighting for them." Luis carefully lifted his trumpet case from under the bench. "Does this mean we can still have music at the gallery?" he asked. Dorothea smiled, touching his cheek. "The gallery needs its musician, doesn't it?" The morning sun had climbed higher now, pouring through the courthouse windows like molten gold. It caught the edges of Grace's sketchbook, the brass of Luis's trumpet case, the silver in Dorothea's hair. Eli looked around at these people who had become so much more than neighbors. They were keepers of a legacy, guardians of something precious. The judge's words seemed to hang in the air. The Josiah Delaney Freedom Gallery, a name that held both history and promise, both memory and hope. Martin Voss sat rigidly in his leather chair, his usually immaculate suit looking slightly rumpled after days in court. Across the polished conference table, Eli watched as the developer's fingers drummed a nervous pattern on the wooden surface. The late afternoon light filtered through the law office's windows, casting long shadows across the settlement papers spread between them. "You understand the terms?" Voss's lawyer asked, his voice carefully neutral. Eli nodded, glancing at Rosa, who sat quietly beside him, her hands folded in her lap. Luis waited outside with Grace, both children sharing a vending machine snack while the adults hammered out the details. "Full restoration of the fire damage," Eli read aloud, his rough hands holding the document carefully. "And the scholarship fund for Luis?" Voss cleared his throat. $20,000 per year, starting when he reaches college age. Held in trust. His voice carried an edge of discomfort, but there was something else there too. A hint of resignation, maybe even relief. "And no public mention of the DNA results," Rosa added softly, meeting Voss's eyes for the first time that day. The developer's facade cracked slightly. "Yes," he said, looking down at his hands. "Though I would like to arrange some visiting time, if that's acceptable to you, Rosa." The room fell silent. Rosa's eyes welled with tears, but she held her chin high. "Luis would like that," she said finally. "He needs his father." Eli watched Voss's shoulders sag slightly, as if a weight he'd carried for years was finally shifting. The man reached for a pen with slightly trembling fingers and signed his name on the dotted line. The scratch of the pen seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "I'll have the first restoration payment transferred tomorrow," Voss said, standing up. He paused, straightening his tie. "And Rosa, thank you for not taking this public. I know you could have." "This was never about hurting anyone," Rosa replied. "It was about truth and giving Luis what he deserves." As they filed out of the conference room, Eli caught sight of Luis and Grace through the glass doors. They sat on a bench, heads bent together over Grace's sketchbook. Luis looked up as the adults emerged, his eyes immediately finding Voss. The developer stopped in his tracks. For a moment, father and son simply looked at each other. Then Voss took a hesitant step forward. Would you like to get ice cream sometime, Luis? Maybe this weekend? Luis's face lit up. Really? He looked at Rosa, who nodded with a watery smile. Really, Voss confirmed, his usual polish cracking further to reveal something genuine underneath. The next morning, Eli stood in front of the scorched barn, coffee mug in hand, surveying the damage in the crisp dawn light. The fire had left ugly black scars up one wall, but the structure was sound. A good thing, too. They had work to do. Pickup trucks began arriving, kicking up dust on the long driveway. First came Joe Martinez, who'd served in the Marines. Then Bill Thompson, Army like Eli. Soon, the gravel lot filled with veterans from 3 generations of service, all answering Eli's call for help. All right, folks, Eli called out, setting down his mug. First order of business is securing the damaged sections. Then we start cleaning and prepping for repairs. He pulled out a stack of plans May had helped him draw up. The Freedom Gallery needs a proper home. The men gathered around, examining the blueprints with professional interest. Some had building experience, others were just willing hands. But all of them understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than themselves. We'll need to replace these support beams, Bill pointed out, tapping the paper, and reinforce the whole north wall. Joe nodded. I know a supplier who might give us a deal on lumber. My cousin works there. The morning air filled with the sound of work boots on gravel and tools being unloaded. Eli watched as the men naturally organized themselves into teams, the old military efficiency kicking in. Some began carefully removing damaged boards, while others took measurements and made supply lists. Dorothea appeared from the farmhouse with a tray of coffee and fresh muffins. Your mama would be proud, she told Eli quietly, nodding at the burst of activity around the barn. Building something that matters. Grace and Luis darted between the workers, eager to help. Grace had appointed herself official photographer, documenting the restoration for the gallery's future displays. Luis carried water to the workers, soaking in their stories between trips. By mid-morning, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air. The burn marks were already starting to disappear under fresh wood and careful hands. Eli stepped back, watching his crew work with the same dedication they'd once given to their country. Now, they were serving their community, turning destruction into something beautiful. The restoration crews worked steadily, their experience and teamwork making quick progress. Veterans who'd felt isolated found purpose again, sharing jokes and stories as they worked. The barn, which had protected its secret treasure for so long, was being reborn through their efforts. Rosa arrived with lunch for everyone, huge pots of her famous chili and stacks of fresh tortillas. The men gathered in the shade of an old oak tree, trading construction tips and military stories. Luis sat among them, eyes wide, soaking in tales of far-off places and the bonds of brotherhood. As the afternoon sun began to sink, Eli walked the perimeter of the barn, checking the day's progress. The scars of the fire were already fading under new lumber and fresh paint. The veterans had accomplished more in one day than he'd hoped for in a week. Their efficiency and dedication proved what he'd always known, that sometimes the best healing comes through helping others. Looking good, boss, Joe called out, securing the last board of the day. The other men were cleaning up, storing tools, and gathering their gear, but there was a satisfaction in their movements that hadn't been there that morning. Eli nodded, pride swelling in his chest, not just for the work done, but for the way these men had come together, finding renewed purpose in creating something lasting for their community. The Freedom Gallery would be more than just a home for art. It would be a testament to resilience, to the power of working together, to the strength found in healing old wounds. As the crew packed up for the day, Eli could see the barn's future taking shape, not just as a gallery, but as a symbol of what their town could accomplish when they stood together. The veterans would return tomorrow and the day after, until the job was done. That's what they did. They saw things through, especially when it mattered most. The pharmacy's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Eli stood at the counter, his worn leather wallet feeling unusually heavy with purpose. The familiar anxiety that usually accompanied these visits was absent, replaced by a quiet certainty. Behind the counter, Mrs. Chen, the pharmacist who had known them for years, smiled warmly as she rang up Grace's prescription. 3 inhalers today, Mr. Mercer? She asked, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. Yes, ma'am, Eli replied, his voice steady. And the preventive one too, please. Grace stood beside him, her fingers tracing patterns on the counter's edge. Her blue backpack, decorated with drawings she'd done herself, hung from one shoulder. She tried to hide her smile, but Eli could see it in the way her eyes crinkled at the corners. Mrs. Chen typed on her computer, the keys clicking softly. "Your insurance copay will be..." She paused, adjusting her glasses. $142 for all four. In the past, those words would have sent a cold spike through Eli's chest. He'd have had to choose between inhalers or groceries, between medicine or rent. But today, he pulled out the gallery's healthcare card without hesitation. "Here you go," he said, handing it over. Mrs. Chen swiped the card, and the machine beeped its approval. The sound seemed to echo in Eli's mind, a simple noise that meant so much more than just a completed transaction. It meant security. It meant breathing easy, in more ways than one. As Mrs. Chen bagged the inhalers, Grace bounced on her toes, her excitement barely contained. "Can we go to the park after this, Dad?" she asked, her voice carrying that musical lilt it got when she was happy. "Sure can, sweetheart," Eli answered, signing the receipt. "We've got time before dinner." Mrs. Chen handed over the white paper bag. "Here you are, dear." "And Grace?" She leaned over the counter conspiratorially. "I heard about the gallery. My Henry said the paintings are beautiful." Grace beamed. "They are, and Dad's helping fix up the whole barn. You should come see it when it's done." "I will, honey. I certainly will." Grace practically skipped to the door, pushing it open with both hands. The little bell above jingled merrily as she burst out into the late afternoon sunshine. Eli followed more slowly, nodding goodbye to Mrs. Chen. Outside, Grace spun in a circle on the sidewalk, her arms spread wide. Her dark hair caught the golden light, and her laugh, clear and strong, rang out across the parking lot. No wheezing, no catching her breath. Just pure joy. "Dad," she called, pointing to the west where the sun was beginning its descent. "Look at the sky." Eli stopped beside her, taking in the view. The sunset had painted the clouds in brilliant oranges and pinks, like one of Josiah Delaney's canvases come to life. Grace took a deep breath, the kind of breath that used to frighten him, waiting for the wheeze that would follow, but it didn't come. She just smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting the evening light. A lump formed in his throat as he watched her. In that moment, she looked so much like her mother. The same quiet strength, the same artistic soul that could find beauty in everything. He remembered all the nights he'd sat beside her bed, listening to her struggling breaths, feeling helpless. All the times he'd had to tell her, "Not today," when she wanted to run and play like other kids. Grace slipped her small hand into his rough one, squeezing gently. "Thank you, Dad," she said softly. "For what, sweetheart?" "For not giving up. For fighting for the paintings. For," she gestured vaguely at the pharmacy behind them, "for everything." Eli's vision blurred slightly as he looked down at his daughter, standing tall and breathing free in the fading sunlight. He squeezed her hand back, and his lips moved in a silent prayer of thanks. For the gallery, for the community that had stood with them, but most of all, for this moment with his daughter, watching her breathe in the evening air without fear. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fresh paint and newly cut wood as people gathered outside the restored barn, where charred timbers had once stood. Gleaming white boards now rose proudly against the morning sky. Dorothea's farm had never looked more alive, with cars lining the long driveway and colorful fall mums dotting the entrance. Grace stood next to her father, her new dress swishing around her knees. Her breathing came easy and steady. No wheezing, no struggle. She squeezed Eli's hand as they watched Dorothea approach the red ribbon stretched across the barn's entrance. "Look at all the people," Grace whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. The crowd filled the yard. Church ladies who'd cleaned frames, veterans who'd kept watch, neighbors who'd brought casseroles during the restoration. May from the library stood near the front, clutching a folder of newspaper clippings about Josiah Delaney. Even Martin Voss had come, standing awkwardly at the edge of the gathering, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the casual country attire around him. Rosa adjusted Luis's collar as he held his trumpet, the brass catching the morning light. The boy's eyes kept darting to where Voss stood, a mix of hope and uncertainty on his young face. The DNA results had changed everything, but new relationships took time to build. "Friends and neighbors," Dorothea's voice rang out clear and strong. "Today we celebrate more than just art on walls. We celebrate truth preserved, justice served, and community united." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "The Josiah Delaney Freedom Gallery belongs to all of us, to our children and our children's children." The scissors glinted as she cut the ribbon. Applause erupted, and the first visitors began filing into the transformed space. Where bare walls had once stood, Delaney's vibrant paintings now hung in perfect rows, each one illuminated by carefully placed gallery lights. The self-portrait, rescued from the root cellar, held the place of honor near the entrance. Josiah's eyes seemed to welcome each person who stepped inside. Grace led a group of younger children to her favorite painting, the church scene Eli had first discovered. "See how he captured the light through the windows?" she explained, sounding like a seasoned docent. "And look at all the different faces in the congregation." Rosa moved through the crowd, sharing the story of her great-uncle and Josiah, her voice strong with pride. She'd set up a small historical display in one corner, featuring photographs and letters that told the tale of art hidden away and finally brought to light. The veterans who'd helped with restoration stood together near their handiwork, new support beams that had replaced the fire-damaged ones. Each beam bore the signature of the man who'd installed it, a testament to healing both the barn and themselves. Eli watched it all from near the entrance, his throat tight with emotion. Pastor Harlan appeared beside him, clapping him on the shoulder. "You did good, son," the pastor said softly. "This is what legacy looks like." The murmur of conversation hushed as Luis stepped forward, trumpet raised. The first clear notes of Amazing Grace soared upward, pure and true. The sound filled every corner of the restored barn, echoing off the paintings that had waited so long in darkness to be seen. People instinctively drew together as Luis played, his music weaving through the rafters where generations of barn swallows had nested. Grace closed her eyes, swaying slightly to the melody. Rosa's tears flowed freely as she watched her son perform, and even Voss seemed moved, his usual businesslike expression softening as he listened to his newly acknowledged son. The trumpet's golden notes continued to rise, carrying with them all the hope and heartache, all the struggle and triumph of their journey. Luis played with his whole heart, each note a testimony to freedom found, truth revealed, and healing begun. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the barn's new windows, painting golden squares on the polished wooden floor. The dedication ceremony had ended, but people lingered, their voices a gentle hum as they admired the artwork hanging on freshly painted walls. The smell of coffee and homemade cookies drifted from folding tables near the entrance. Eli stood near one of Josiah's landscapes, explaining its history to an elderly couple when he noticed Martin Voss slip through the barn doors. The developer looked different today. His usual crisp suit replaced by a casual sweater and slacks. His polished confidence seemed cracked, revealing something raw underneath. Luis sat on the edge of the small stage where he'd played earlier, carefully cleaning his trumpet. The brass gleamed under the lights as his small fingers moved with practiced care over each valve. He hadn't noticed Voss yet, but Rosa had. She tensed from where she stood, arranging programs, her eyes tracking Voss's every move. The developer paused several times on his way across the barn, as if fighting an urge to retreat. His shoes made soft sounds against the wood floor. A few people whispered and pointed, but most were kind enough to look away, giving this moment the privacy it deserved. Luis looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps, his hands stilled on the trumpet, eyes widening as he recognized Voss. The boy's shoulders hunched slightly, a defensive posture Eli had seen too many times before. Voss stopped a few feet away. "That was beautiful playing," he said, his voice rough. "The hymn, I haven't heard it played like that in years." Luis ducked his head. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of absence and unspoken words. Voss shifted his weight, then slowly, deliberately, lowered himself to one knee. The motion brought him eye level with Luis, and for the first time, their resemblance was startling. The same dark eyes, the same slight curve to their mouths. "Luis," Voss said, then stopped, swallowing hard. His hands opened and closed at his sides. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't there, that I pretended not to know." Luis's fingers tightened around his trumpet, but he didn't look away. Across the room, Rosa pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes shining with tears. "I was scared," Voss continued, his voice barely carrying above the murmur of the crowd. "And selfish. But watching you play today," he gestured to the trumpet, managing a shaky smile. "You have an amazing gift, and I'd like to know my son. If you'll let me." Luis glanced toward his mother. Rosa gave him a small nod, permission and encouragement in one gentle motion. The boy turned back to Voss, studying him with serious eyes that seemed too old for his young face. "Will you come to my next recital?" Luis asked quietly. Voss nodded quickly. "Front row, I promise. And maybe," Luis hesitated, "maybe we could get ice cream sometimes? Mom says it's okay if you want to. I'd like that very much. Voss's voice cracked on the words. He opened his arms slightly, a question in the gesture. Would it be all right if I gave you a hug? Luis set his trumpet carefully aside. For a long moment, he just sat there, and the whole barn seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, he slid off the stage and took a step forward. Voss's arms wrapped around his son for the first time, gentle and uncertain. Luis stood stiff for a moment before gradually relaxing, his small hands coming up to grip the back of Voss's sweater. The developer's shoulders shook slightly as he held his boy, and he pressed his face into Luis's dark hair. "Thank you, son," Voss whispered. "Thank you." Across the room, Rosa wasn't even trying to hide her tears anymore. They rolled freely down her cheeks as she watched her son and his father begin to bridge the gap of years. Eli moved quietly to her side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. She leaned into the support, drawing strength from his presence. "He's going to be okay," Eli murmured. "They both are." Rosa nodded, unable to speak. Her hand came up to cover Eli's on her shoulder, squeezing gently as they watched the new father and son slowly pull apart. Luis was smiling now, shy but real, and even Voss's eyes were suspiciously bright as he ruffled the boy's hair. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But here in the restored barn, surrounded by art that spoke of freedom and hope, it was a beginning. And sometimes, Eli thought, watching Rosa's tears fall as her son found his father at last, that was more than enough. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke through Dorothea's kitchen window. Late afternoon, sunlight streamed across her worn farmhouse table, where 5 plates held half-eaten slices of still-warm apple pie. The kitchen glowed with warmth and easy laughter, a scene that would have seemed impossible just months ago. And then, Grace said, barely containing her giggles, Dad tried to hang that huge painting all by himself. It slipped, and he had to do this weird dance to catch it. "Hey now," Eli protested, but his eyes crinkled with humor. "That frame was heavier than it looked." Luis, sitting between his mother and Grace, grinned. "At least you didn't drop it like I almost did with the trumpet during practice yesterday." Rosa reached over to ruffle her son's hair. "But you recovered beautifully, Mijo, just like your solo at the dedication." "Speaking of music," Dorothea said, rising to pour more coffee into their mugs, "I was thinking we could host monthly concerts in the gallery. Let the local musicians play while people view the art." "That's perfect," Grace exclaimed. She pulled her ever-present sketchbook from her bag and started scribbling. "We could set up chairs here, and maybe have the performers." Eli watched his daughter gesture animatedly, her breathing clear and strong. No wheezing, no reaching for an inhaler. The regular medication schedule, finally affordable, had worked wonders. She'd even started taking art classes at the community center on Saturdays. "The Veterans Restoration crew wants to help too," Eli added. "They're talking about building proper display cases for some of the smaller pieces." Rosa nodded, her eyes bright. "And I've been recording stories from the older folks in town. So many memories of Josiah, of that time. We should have a space to share those histories." "My great-uncle would have loved that," she continued softly. "He always said art wasn't just for looking at. It was for bringing people together." Dorothea reached across the table to squeeze Rosa's hand. "And look at us now. He was right." Luis pushed his empty plate away, looking thoughtful. "Mr. Voss, my father. He said he might come to the concerts sometimes." His voice held equal measures of hope and uncertainty. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Rosa said. "Small steps." Grace drew closer to Luis, pointing at something in her sketchbook. "Look, I thought we could put your music stand right here, where the light hits best." The two children bent their heads together, lost in planning. Eli caught Rosa's eye across the table, sharing a quiet moment of gratitude. Their kids were healing, growing stronger together. "Well," Dorothea declared, standing to gather plates, "I'd say this calls for seconds. Who's ready for more pie?" A chorus of "me" rang out, making the old farmhouse kitchen feel even warmer. They lingered at the table as afternoon melted into evening, trading ideas and memories. Grace showed off her latest sketches. Luis hummed snippets of new songs he was learning. Rosa shared stories from her growing oral history collection. Dorothea remembered her husband's careful record-keeping that had helped save everything, and Eli simply soaked it in, this precious moment with his found family. When the sun finally dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across Dorothea's yard, it was time to head home. They said their goodbyes with hugs and promises to meet again soon. Rosa and Luis headed for their car, while Eli and Grace decided to walk the short distance home past the barn. The gallery stood proud against the darkening sky, its fresh paint gleaming. Light spilled from the windows where the evening security lamps had clicked on, making the building glow like a beacon. Inside, Josiah's paintings hung in their rightful place, telling their stories of freedom, faith, and community to all who came to see. Eli and Grace paused on the path, taking in the sight. His daughter slipped her hand into his, just like she used to when she was smaller. "This is what treasure is," Eli whispered, squeezing her hand as the barn's golden light spilled into the growing dark. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Eli Mercer, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.